We are joined today by a friend and customer of Vevox, Tom Langston. Tom's from the University of Portsmouth and is a digital learning and teaching specialist. We've been working with Tom for a couple of years now and supporting the university with Vevox, and Tom's been supporting us with that rollout and supporting staff there with using Vevox in interesting and innovative ways. And one of those Tom's going to talk about today, which is around co-creation. So, Tom, without further ado, I'm going to make you a presenter, and I'm going to let you take it away.
So it should know the presentation, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Yes, lovely. Too many screens, too much technology going on. Well, thank you very much for inviting me along today, Joe, and everyone at Vevox. It's a pleasure to be here. As Joe mentioned, I've been doing some work on sort of co-creation, but I've been doing it with my colleague, Stuart Sims, who is much more of the expert in this field. But feel free to ask me questions through the chat, or my email is currently on screen. And if I can't answer it directly, I'll be able to speak to him and we'll hopefully support you on the way. So again, without further ado, as Joe said, I've got a few bits to use Vevox for today. And I'm going to start straight away with what word comes to mind when you hear co-creation. So when if you've done it before, if you haven't done it, I've got a minute on the clock to put something in. What do you think of when you hear co-creation? For me, while everyone's typing something in, for me, I never realized I'd done it before until I'd started doing the work with Stuart. And I think there's a lot of things in here which I can sort of see coming in that I'd done in part and just never had it in sort of that particular frame. So a couple of seconds left. Seeing some really interesting bits appear here. So I hope see how many of them we get through. So yes, the biggest one by far there is collaboration. And of course, that's exactly what sort of co-creation relies on, is that collaborative element between yourself and your students and even colleagues. The ones I saw, so buzzword kind of sort of struck me. It's not one I've seen before when I've done this session, and it's quite interesting to almost get to unpack that, in that I guess it is a buzzword for what we're doing, but it's so much more than just one thing, and I think that's what I'm hopefully going to sort of get to through today. So we've got student as producer and student as partner, and again, that's a really interesting bit, because I think there's different levels that we can get to. The other one I saw in there, and it's trouble is in grey, but anxiety. I'd be quite interested to hear. So maybe if someone could put it in the questions, why they may feel anxious about co-creation, because I think there's a lot of things you can do that are very simple in terms of this, and it goes to that main one of collaboration. So starting with this definition from Boville and colleagues, when staff and students work collaboratively with one another to create components of curricular and or pedagogical approaches. So just as the big buzzword came through of collaboration, it's about working with your students to produce something. And what we're going to look at is the fact that what you produce doesn't have to be wildly in depth. There are small things that you can do that would still be cast as co-creation, that you can do in a very simple way. Why do you use co-creation? And I think this works nicely in that we can't assume we know what the students want. Obviously, we have, depending on how long you've been in teaching or in education, you'll have your experience and what you've done before and how that works. I think the trouble is that can evolve. We've all had sort of different experiences with teaching, where one thing you do with one class will work really well, and then you do the same thing next year or with a parallel class even, and it doesn't work at all. And it's not that the activity is bad, it's just that different people come to it in different ways. And I think this is what we need to kind of get to with co-creation. And my point to this about expectations as well, we'll get to as we go through, but we can't assume we know what they want. We'll have a good idea, we'll have had our experiences, but it's about getting that conversation and essentially the buy-in from students, or whoever we're working with. Again, if you're not necessarily in education, or you're looking at educational bits, it's a good way of getting stakeholders to invest and take part in what we're trying to work with. So where's co-creation worked? The one I'm going to go through today is setting expectations, but also creating assessment criteria, content, and also sort of the design of how that assessment may play out. Again, depending on where you're working and how things are. Assessment design could be hard because you might have to have it already written before you take it to the students. But again, depending on how you're able to create that design and what you're able to, sort of the framework you're able to work in, you can get creative with having a very broad brush approach to the assessment design that you can then sort of shape with the students. It's kind of like you've got the lump of clay that is the assessment, but actually what you do with it afterwards could vary depending on the group or the nature of the sort of the students' sort of learner profiles and abilities. Assessment criteria is one that I'll touch on very quickly before moving on to the expectation side of this. But what's worked quite nicely is I recently undertook the academic professional apprenticeship, and I'm now working with the course team, and since I've graduated on it, and I'm doing actually sort of teaching and marking and doing parts with them on that. And what's really interesting is from the first assessment criteria that we kind of created in the first sort of run of it, they use that as the basis to give to the students now, who then go, oh, I don't like that bit, or I like this bit. And people change the weighting of what they feel is important about the assessment, so that you have the framework of what you're going to mark people on, but actually the group that you're going to be marking have that buy-in to know what's going to be important to them. Some people may want to sort of have reflection as a bigger part of it. Some people may want the sort of the final project to have a bigger sort of part of it. And again, it's then being able to design that assessment to fit. And again, I fully appreciate here, this is where that kind of bit of where's the anxiety come from. This could feel very, very alien and very, very sort of like, where do I start? Essentially, to the expectation side of it, it's just about that collaborative conversation. You don't have to action all of the things that are suggested, but what you can do is go, that's a really good idea. I'll take that bit and put it into this framework. So for me, the expectations, especially where we've been online, are very sort of triangular, in that you've got your expectation of the students, what you're expecting from them when they start to learn. They'll have expectations of you and the course that they're going to be taking up. Again, the expectations currently are pretty very different from what they were 1, 2, and 5 years ago. I think there's another one which has always been there, but has been handled very differently, and that's expectations of each other at the student level. I think one of the bits I had recently was talking to some students while trying to help academics develop sessions for using sort of Zoom breakout rooms or whatever sort of software you use in that respect. One of the students was sort of saying he'd been working with a group in a breakout room and it was great. He then got moved to another breakout room where the students didn't turn their cameras on and didn't turn their microphones on, and he's just sat there with 2 other people, not able to have a conversation or do anything because they won't sort of get involved. And I think if we don't start the conversation and don't start sort of week 1 with what everyone is expecting as part of this process, it's very hard to try and fix that sort of later down the line. It's easier to sort of, you know, put a whole new piece of pipe in than it is to kind of keep sticking plasters over the hole. So I think setting expectations from everybody involved in the process of what they think of each other and what they think of you and you think of them, if you have that kind of on the cards, almost as either a manifesto or a kind of I can't think of the word, like a guideline for your module before you even get to start the actual teaching, for me, that's a really good place to build that foundation from. And again, that's kind of using co-creation. So this is a sort of a fairly famous model from Bovell and Bully of the co-creation ladder. And what I'm going to do is go through some activities today, looking at how you can use co-creation with Vevox to work around that ladder. So at the very bottom, it's a dictated curriculum. There's no interaction from the students. You turn up, the traditional sage on the stage type model where you just talk to people, and that would be at the bottom, to the full at the top, anarchic students in control where they run absolutely everything. And again, from what Stuart has said to me in the past, Boville and Bully aren't advocating for doing the full students in control. If you can get there and it works for you, then fantastic. It's an interesting place to be. What I think they're advocating for is just trying to pitch yourself at more than just the bottom rung. As you can see, it goes up that ladder from offering a few little sort of prescribed choices all the way up to sort of the partnership and negotiated curriculum, which again, not everyone's going to be doing and will obviously provide some level of anxiety, but that's not where you should start. One of the bits Stuart has said is people tend to ask him, is that co-creation, when they're trying to come up with something? And the answer is probably always yes. Because if you're thinking about that conversation, if you're thinking about collaborating with your students, that is an element of co-creation. It is what you're doing. You're having a conversation with the students. So sometimes you don't need to worry about, am I doing it right? But just the fact you're doing something is better than not. So while I'm here, obviously, today on helping out sort of Vevox, and like I said, it's a pleasure to be here. Within the university, we have a whole range of tools. Now, we don't actually have Mentimeter, but I've put this on there only because I know a lot of people are comfortable with it. They've found it in their research of using audience response, and that's their go-to. Equally, Nearpod does some things sort of differently. But what my point from the technical side of this is, any one of these tools can fit the model. You can use any part of any one sort of audience response tool to get up that ladder and get sort of creative. So again, what I'm going to demonstrate here is using it with Vevox. So this is a question. Feel free to answer. You can vote up to 4 choices. I think this is always one of the harder bits when doing online teaching, is giving people the time to put their answers in and staying quiet, and you're just sat in your room in silence. It's very different to being in a real lecture theatre, sort of seeing people do something. Obviously, I can see the responses at the top left to see that you are very kindly answering my question, but I'll just sit here and rabbit on my own. So that's a big split, and the answer is all of them. Every one of those is part of what goes towards co-creation. But this kind of comes to me as it's a basic question. It's a multiple choice question, very easy for you as the kind of the audience, as the student, to come in, make a vote, have a little bit of a sway in a massive anonymous sea of other people, and we get the percentages on the PowerPoint. This is where it starts with sort of the co-creation side of things. We go up the ladder a bit to participants. Still, I'm in control, I'm doing this, but you've put something in. What we've suggested in terms of sort of the general co-creative nature is it's a good way to check knowledge. Obviously, many people will have used Vevox or similar voting tools, or just asked questions with post-it notes in a face-to-face session. But it's finding out what the student knows before the session, so that you can then maybe adapt your teaching to cover off bits they may have missed from the last lecture, or start further down the line where you're thinking of. You can also use it as a sort of not a competitive one, but what you're doing is getting a consensus of opinion. So it's not just a knowledge check, but it's a consensus of opinion. What you're doing is finding out what the class want to work on next. What's the next area they want to cover? Do they need? So again, you could be planning revision sessions. What you're going to do in that co-creative nature is say, right, do you want to look more at this side of the assessment or this side of the assessment? And you can sort of try and balance it out. So if you get a larger proportion around, the first artifact, depending on where the split is, and 50-50 is always a pain in the backside. But what you can try and do is devote that percentage of time to each element and answer the questions of people. It can be done on the fly, and it works both in class, it works online. It's a really good way of doing it within a large session. One of the things I found with the academics that use different audience response at the university, they use them in lectures heavily, but not necessarily so much in seminars, because within the smaller group, it's much easier to have that sort of general conversation. But again, for those that do it, some still use it in a seminar if they know the group are quiet and like their anonymity. And again, it could be a cultural thing, and this provides that kind of inclusivity as well. So this one actually isn't, we're not going to do it today, just because of the time frame we're working to. But I've got in here one from a Padlet. So this is a screenshot. If you want to have a look, what I will do is you can go to that link at your own time. But the idea being is what I've got here is learning objectives from the unit that I'm teaching, and the students are then basically putting notes on the Padlet wall onto that particular bit. So they're making comments, they're upvoting and downvoting different learning objectives. Obviously, when I made this presentation, there wasn't the heat map question that you now sort of get within Vevox. So again, what you could do is sort of have a few different ideas and get the students to put a sort of a heat map of the bits they like the most. So again, you could use that directly within Vevox as well. But it's, for me, this is about doing a little bit more and sharing something, and that puts us further up that ladder. So what you're able to do is get more of a personal feedback rather than just a sort of a percentage or question sort of idea. You're able to get much more inclusion. It moves us up where they're given more choices, they're given more ability to have their say into that. It's also a good way of, as I say there, clarifying concepts. What you could do is put up a few statements that they then have to kind of sort of either reinterpret or re-explain. But again, what it does is helps them to frame their knowledge within that. Within the expectation side of things, what you could have would be a few different sort of areas where the students kind of essentially sort of weight or rate or expand on those bits of what is expected within the classroom situation. You know, I expect when we do a breakout session to turn your camera and microphone on. You know, I don't expect it to be on for the lecturer side of things, but I do expect it when I'm working in a group. If it's face-to-face, what do you expect then? How much do you expect people to take a part of their learning? Obviously, with these ones, it does take some time to compile and put the information and read it together. And again, that could be another activity in and of itself that they then feed back and distill to the group. It depends on the time you're working with and how much you want to allow them to do that. It could very well be that you get them to do this at the end of a session, you synthesize the data, you sort of compile it and bring it back at the beginning of the next session. So it's further up that ladder, giving them a little bit more choice. So this is an open text question. It's slightly longer, but what areas of practice would work best for you within co-creation? It's trying to find out now what you would work to and work well with for co-creation. For me, I've always liked the like I said, the conversational bit. So within the teaching, I've now started doing. Like I say, it works really nicely for that assessment criteria. But actually, with how I've worked, when the science faculty came to me and said, we want to know how to make a breakout room, I was like, well, have you asked the students why they're leaving? And everyone was like, no. And so for me, it was that chance to get the students to feed back to something and then have a Zoom meeting with a few representatives to again unpack and unpick those kind of statements and things that we'd had come through. So it really was a very interesting bit of getting feedback on what the student wanted and what we could then do to make their learning sort of more relevant, because some of the students had said some of the breakout sessions had been really well planned, and they were you know, that the ones that worked had a particular element to them, and the ones that hadn't were ones where, for instance, it was role play, but they were given scripts, so there wasn't really role play. You were just reading to each other, and they felt no value in breaking out to do that because they could just read that online. It didn't it didn't give them sort of a sense of development. So there are things that you can do to again unpack what the students would really like to do and that would work for them. So time's almost up. Thank you very much to everyone doing this. Now, because of how Vevox works, I will pull up the answer here. There we go. So what areas of practice work best for co-creation? Academic debates. Yes. So get feedback from students and redesign a module based on that. Yeah. So it's, I guess, depending on where you want to put yourself on that ladder, it could be very much a student-centered learning. It could very well be that what you've got is 5 or 6 ideas that you'll want to work with, and just get them to pick the 2 that are going to sort of shape how you're designing the module. So you may not be to that, like I said, a fully kind of student-centered creation of that. Assessment criteria, in-class peer feedback on it. That's a really nice idea. Getting the students to like discuss what you're going to be doing going forward, drop-ins, practical work. So a really good range and quite a lot of formative assessment things going on as well. Thank you for everyone that's put that through for me. So that, for me, goes towards a collaboration space. What we've done is given a sort of a full free rein, loads of answers. It was really useful for generating ideas. It gives more freedom to the student, and again, rather than sort of like with the Padlet idea where we had sort of shaped questions and worked with it, what you're able to do is put yourself through the answers. What you can then do is get sort of the next time round to take take some of the sort of consistent themes. So like there's quite a few with formative feedback, for instance. So what I could do is put different ideas for formative feedback, and then they vote on it using the quiz one. So we've worked at the top level towards the top level of the ladder, and then the next week we may then go back down and just do kind of a sort of a simple sort of element to that. I think the main bit is that to simulate discussion, and as it says there, it also includes what's not feasible. So the students may come to you with lots of ideas, but actually they may not all be possible. But at least if you can explain why they're not possible, they're more likely to accept that their voice has been heard, understood, and you're going to sort of move on from there. So it's not that you're dictating everything, but you're also sort of setting expectations. What you're doing is saying, we can't do all of these things, but we can do 2 of them, and we can do them well. And this is what I want to do. And you then, they can help you shape that sort of part of the practice. So as I say, there's plenty of ways of doing this. We're a Google institution at the University of Portsmouth, but obviously OneDrive, which I didn't put up there, would be the same as kind of the Google Drive idea. You could get it to be done on a Google form. A Padlet, if you've got that. You've got Miro as well, which I've not put up there. Again, we've got Zoom, you've got the sort of the breakout rooms in Zoom, but Google Meet now does it. WebEx does it. They all have the same similar tools and a slightly different way of approaching it, which goes to the summary here, where co-creation is a principle rather than a specific resource or practice to make something happen. What you're doing is coming with an idea and using the tools that you have to hand. For some of us who are lucky enough to have things like Vevox, we can use that. It may very well just be Post-it notes. My kind of hat is audience response. I really enjoy that kind of idea of getting students involved in the learning. I'm very much kind of an engaged learner rather than someone who sits and just writes notes in a lecture. So for me, it's trying to offer students that facilitated large group discussions where they can say something, but anonymously. It doesn't have to be something that everyone kind of gets on board with. I think we need to just reassess what we've got. I think we need to see what we're doing, and it may be a very small change that can then get you involved with a co-creative part of your module or your unit or your course, however you're doing this. But for me, it's about buy-in, and we get that buy-in from setting their expectations of what they can do, what they expect from you, and what we can achieve together. So last question, have you ever tried co-creation? I know it seems funny to put this at the end, but actually it's one of those, with all the things I've talked about, you may now go, oh, actually I have done co-creation, I just didn't realize that's what it was. So if some of you are putting number 4, then I've done my job badly, but I can live with that. But then I'm also available outside of here to happily talk about this with anyone and everyone that would like to. Oh, so no 4s, thank you. So lots of people there, almost half have done it once or twice. A few people want to get on board, and there's a few people who are actually doing it quite a lot at the moment. So thank you for your time. What I will do is pull up, where is it? There it is. And we go back to the conversation. So co-creation requires working outside your comfort zone. This is the anxiety, enabling co-creation, managing student and teacher's anxiety, safe space, no space. Thank you. Yes, with this, yeah, it is something outside your comfort zone if you're trying to get to the top of that ladder. If you're trying to do the massive kind of redesigning a whole sort of curricula with the students, it would be, because it's not something that many people have done at that kind of level. But I think using it to manage student and teachers' expectations, you can do on a much smaller level that hopefully won't breed anxiety, because you're not really seeing it as co-creation. It's just something that you're doing. Sometimes it can also be that fear of the technology to get it right, and that works. And all I can say is, you saw how easy it was for me to use Vevox today within this. But again, when I speak to my colleagues at the university, I always say, this is what I'd like you to use, but if you're comfortable doing this, start with your comfort zone, get comfortable with what it is that you're doing, and then we can, adapt it to other platforms. But I think from me, it's trying to get people at the ground level, the new academics coming in, and sort of offering them all these tools that they can then not feel sort of too anxious.
Tom, there is a question here that's now come to the top in terms of most liked, which I'll just highlight it.
Thank you.
Bring it up. I saw this coming in, actually. I was quite interested to hear your answer. So what kind of considerations do you have to make when using Vevox or something similar in sort of small groups rather than large, and what are the differences in those situations?
I think partly it's going to be knowing your students to some degree. Now, obviously, if you're doing this week 1, that's going to be hard because you don't know them yet. I think what you have to do is before you use any piece of kit, whatever that might be, you've got to ask what you want to achieve with your students, rather than I want to use Vevox because I want to, because we've got it. I like I say, I love it, and I love using tech to sort of enhance teaching. So when you're doing it in small groups, I guess it will depend on a number of factors. Kind of like I mentioned, maybe culturally people aren't expecting to engage in the process. They're expecting, even in a small group, to have someone talk to them and that be it. So if they're not comfortable in opening up and asking a question, this gives you a really nice way of doing it, where no one has to be, people can remain anonymous and not sort of lose face or feel like they're asking a silly question. It's very, very often there are very few silly questions. There's just dumb answers, and that's me all over. I think that the nice bit within the large side of this is the fact you can give everyone a voice in 250-seat, 300-seat lecture theatres. When you get to that small group, I think it definitely comes down to the consideration of, is anyone even speaking when I try and run an activity? If they're not, something like Vevox will work really nicely to get that conversation going. Because once you've answered a few questions, done a few quizzes, you can then ask a question, and you might start to feel that they might start to feel they can come up with an answer. So hopefully that answers that. if it doesn't, then feel free to email me later. Have I used Vevox asynchronously? Not personally. I know it's got the sort of survey. I'm just having to look at the name. We've got the survey feature, so you can do that, and it's something I promote to other academics. But because I kind of only teach on a unit, like 1 or 2 specific sessions, I don't tend to run things outside of that because it's all done within the sort of the VLE. For asynchronous stuff, I tend to use things more like Padlet that I can sort of embed in Moodle that we use, because then you can post the answers. But again, depending on what you want to do, the surveys in this are a fantastic way of doing the questions. And what I love about Vevox is the fact that the ID doesn't change. So you can use that box multiple times, and the students always kind of, if you've never seen it on the mobile app before, I'm lifting my phone up, but you can't see it. But it's about that if they've been into a box once and you don't shut it down, when they go back to the app or go back to the website, at the bottom, it sort of shows you the last few that you've been into, so they can just jump in and answer any question or use the chat feature and things after the fact. So while I haven't done it, I know it does do it, and I can see some really useful bits depending on also how much you're allowed to necessarily survey the students, because obviously there's that whole thing at some universities of only having a set amount of points of survey, as it were, to find out what they want. But again, if you're designing something with the students and it's answer these questions for what we're going to do with our assessment next week, yes, it would work beautifully for that.
That ability to use the same session ID over a sort of sustained period of time is really nice for switching between kind of asynchronous and live sessions. I know lots of people will use a Vevox session across an entire module, and they will be using it live. So live polling and Q&A, and then outside of the live lecture, they will keep the Vevox session open, and they might switch moderation on or something like that in the Q&A, just so the Q&A is not getting out of hand while they're not monitoring it. But it still gives that channel, for students to be able to ask questions asynchronously and respond to surveys and things like that. There's a really interesting question here that I wanted to get your answer on, which is, do you reward students for their contribution?
Again, I'm broke, so no. I don't know of anyone at the university that does the contribution directly, but what we have had is that we have had a few like student ambassador posts that will help engage students across multiple courses or multiple modules and things, and they're kind of like a paid role for sort of a 3-month period. So we don't necessarily sort of give the direct, like, fill this survey in and you'll get a jar of sweets or something. It tends to be, we get engagement from some really students who are very engaged in this. So one of the ones we've had is the reward was making changes to university policy, and now this kind of started just before lockdown, so it's kind of died a bit of a death. But the idea was we set up a co-creation group, and students would bring their ideas of what they didn't like about their modules or teaching, and helped try to fix things. So like one of the bits the students were talking about is like the messaging tool inside Moodle isn't particularly great. So some of the students were going away to look at how they could use, because obviously Moodle's open source, they were basically looking at how to make that a better feature. So it's that kind of bit where the reward is the fact that we listen to them in some respects. That's a bit of a cop-out answer, granted. Again, I know that there are some academics that do low-level rewards. So like, they'll buy a box of Haribo and they'll do sort of prizes, or at least kind of some sort of low-level engagement, but it's not maybe in the way that you're talking about here. So not that I know of, but that doesn't mean to say there aren't people doing it.
Cool. Tom, we've probably got time for one more question, but I know there are a few questions that we won't get through to answering, so maybe we'll have a look at those afterwards, and if there are some themes that stand out, maybe I'll ask you just to give some thoughts on it. But we'll just take this next one, which is how to engage less engaged students in co-creation. Any sort of tips?
Well, I think the bit here is things like Vevox are the perfect tool for that. I think a lot of the time, students that are less engaged are either fearful of saying something or don't want to look foolish. So at least that provides them an anonymous way to do it. I mean, I came up with a completely arbitrary model, which has got no valid data anywhere, but I always used to say it was like 10, 80, 10. You have the 10% at the top that no matter what you do, they're going to engage and they're going to be high flyers. You've got the 80% in the middle that on any given day will either work with you or work against you. And then the bottom 10% that just don't bother at all. And no matter what you do is going to make that better. So for me, it's things like Vevox allow students who have anxiety to take part in the co-creation without being openly verbal about it. But if they're not going to engage at all, maybe we go back to the last point of, if you can add sort of other incentives or rewards to the process. But even then, that not everyone's going to sign up for it.
So potentially more Haribo, is that what you're saying?
Yes, yeah, Haribo sales through the roof. There's two quick ones I'd like to sort of see that.
Yeah, of course.
So someone says they've used other response tools like Mentimeter. I've never heard of WooClap. That's the one for sheep. I embedded Vevox into PowerPoint. Is it easy to do? Simple answer is yes, it's very easy to do. Then, do you think co-creation should be a curricular obligation? That's quite contentious. I think in one respect, yes, it probably should be, because I think without asking them a question to get some expectations that I've been talking about, you can't necessarily give them the best student experience. However, with going back to the anxiety point, it depends. It's that point then of how much do you say you have to do, and what you don't want to do is add to the stress of academics and those sort of in teaching posts. You don't want to add to that stress if they're already under a lot of pressure. So I think what we need to do is add more support. Maybe we need to add more support for co-creation as part of the curricula, but making it completely obligatory. I'd like to think, again, back to the utopian thing. Utopia, yes, I don't think it's actually feasible, but I think there's definitely elements that we could sort of demystify and make easier for people to do.
Cool. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, that was really interesting. And thank you, everyone, for sending in your questions. And if there are any we've missed, I will, I'll try and get those over to Tom and get his thoughts on them. I just want to share with you guys just a couple of things before we go. Can you guys see my screen okay? Moment. Cool. So I just wanted to let you guys know about our YouTube channel. I'd highly recommend subscribing to that. It gives you access to all of our instructional videos and webinar recordings, such as the recording we've done today, but also all of the historical ones that we've done. So we've got a great library now of webinars such as this, going back over 3 or 4 years. So it's a fantastic resource to have a look at. And also our newsletter, which will give you all the latest updates and stories and resources from Vevox. Finally, I just want to let you know about the next webinar. So we've got another webinar as part of this series coming up on the 28th of October. It's being run by Rob Lowney from DCU, and it's all around devising cognitively engaging quiz questions, which I'm really keen to find out about. So that looks like it's going to be a good session. So if you registered for this session, there was the option to register for the entire series, so you may well be registered for that already, but do go back onto our website and have a look and register if you have not. Cool. Thank you very much to everyone for joining today. Thank you, Tom, as well for running it and sharing that. That was brilliant. And yeah, I look forward to hopefully seeing as many of you as possible at the next webinar. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much for having me.
Cheers.